certainly there are a lot of children's rights abuses all over the world. It's not something that's specific to any one country or any one region. I think some of the worst abuses that we see today are in the context of armed conflict. Children who are being recruited for use as soldiers, being sent to fight in armed combat, or girls primarily who are being used for sexual purposes, who are being raped and subjected to very serious sexual assaults by soldiers who are participating in armed conflicts. Certainly, in some countries, we see thousands and thousands of children who are being used in these ways. One of the worst is the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there have been literally hundreds of thousands of women and girls who have been raped during the conflict there, and tens of thousands of children, including both boys and girls, who have been recruited, often by force, and sent to fight at the front lines of armed conflict, and sometimes literally sacrificed as cannon fodder. Yeah. Children become soldiers in actually a number of different ways. Some of them literally are forced at gunpoint or kidnapped from their homes and threatened with death if they don't cooperate, if they don't pick up a gun and fight. That's the case, for example, for many years in northern Uganda, where tens of thousands of children were abducted by the Lord's Resistance Army and forced to fight, and basically threatened with death and if they didn't cooperate. In Burma, for example, we see forced recruitment as the primary means of getting children as soldiers. And there it's a bit different. It's the government that's recruiting children. It's not armed rebel groups. And children aren't being abducted from their homes. They're being picked up off the streets. What we've seen is that the Burmese military is, military recruiters in Burma's army are under such pressure to meet recruitment quotas that they have discovered that preying upon young boys in public places is one of the easiest ways of getting new recruits. So they will approach boys in train stations, in markets, in public squares, at bus stations, and threaten and coerce them. Ask them if they have identity documents, and if they don't, they'll say, well, then you have to go to jail. Or if you don't want to go to jail, you can go to the army instead. And we've seen that this is a pattern to use boys as young as 11 years old and basically force them into the army. So there are certainly examples of forced recruitment and abduction, but in many conflicts, children join because they feel like they have no other options. In wartime, society breaks down. Schools shut down, children are separated from their parents, sometimes they're forced to flee their homes, there are no jobs, and in a situation of intense insecurity, oftentimes these children believe that joining an armed group is their best chance of survival, or at least their best chance of getting the occasional meal or a bed to sleep in. So it's not that they necessarily want to become soldiers, but they feel like they have no other good alternatives. And then there are some children who join because they are politically motivated. They believe that they're fighting on behalf of their community. They may be fighting for revenge against a government or an armed group that has committed abuses against their own family or against their community. And they believe that it's their responsibility. So that's certainly the case in some circumstances as well. And then finally, there are some children who join because they want the prestige. They want the uniform. They want to be able to carry a gun. They're attracted by what they perceive as a glamorous life. Maybe they've been promised money. Maybe they've been promised education. So there are lots of different reasons why children join. But at the end of the day, many of these children find that life is brutal. It's very difficult to serve as a soldier, and that their health, their well-being, and their lives are at stake. Well, we can't generalize across all situations, but there are some countries or some armed groups, government forces, that do brutalize children in some very significant ways. Children are given drugs to reduce their fears and supposedly make them more fearless combatants. Children are manipulated We have had instances where children are told that if they wear a special amulet around their neck, or if they smear a special oil on their body, they're going to be protected. And so they wear the amulet, or they put the oil on their bodies, and they run off into battle thinking that they're going to be okay. And of course they're not. One of the reasons why children are recruited as soldiers is often because they are so easy to manipulate, and especially younger children who don't yet know the difference between right and wrong can often be coerced or influenced to commit atrocities that maybe an older person wouldn't, because they know that it's just not right. And certainly some children are brainwashed and, told a lot of lies about what might happen to them if they surrender to the other force, for example. They're told what would happen to them if they try to escape, if they disobey orders. And through a pattern of brutality and terror, these children are taught to obey. Well, at the community level, what's really important is that children have options. The most important thing is that they have the ability to go to school. A child who has access to education is much less likely to be recruited, or much less likely to join an armed group than a child who's out of school, for example. Establishing community protection systems. So, for example, that there are monitoring committees of teachers and elders and religious leaders who are keeping tabs on children and who start to notice if children are not showing up at school or if they've been recruited, and start following these trends and can intervene and find ways to interrupt these patterns before they develop. Certainly, negotiating with commanders, both from government side and from opposition forces, to engage with them in dialogue about why they shouldn't be using children, why it's a violation of international law, why it's not in the best interest of the child, and why the child is going to be better off, in school or, with their families. So there's a lot that needs to be done at community level. One of the things that we found fundamental is the need for stronger international standards. 10 years ago, under international law, it was still legal to recruit a 15-year-old and send them off into armed combat. That was perfectly legitimate under international law. And thankfully, since then, there's been a mobilization by NGOs and others to influence new treaties that set the minimum age for participation in armed conflict now at 18. And 130 governments have now ratified this treaty. The use of children under the age of 15 is now recognized as a war crime. And there are individuals like Thomas Lubanga who are currently under trial at the International Criminal Court for using child soldiers, and may face decades or life imprisonment as a result. So at the international level, having clear standards, creating a deterrent effect through criminalization of child recruitment is very important. Another role that's important is that of the Security Council. The UN Security Council in the last few years has really taken the issue of child recruitment very seriously. It created a special working group just to look at abuses against children in armed conflict. It has asked the Secretary General to provide the names of governments and armed groups that are using child soldiers every year. And one by one, they look at the countries where child soldiers are being used. And they talk about what action they can take, whether it's letters, public appeals, or even the possibility of arms embargoes or other sanctions against the perpetrators to try and get them to abide by their international obligations.